I once heard about a 72-year-old man who shared the most terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed in his life. He said there were 72 bodies hanging from trees all at once. Men, dogs, and even horses, all swaying together in the same grove. The stench of death was so thick in the air that he swore every single tree felt cursed by something holy and rotten at the same time. And the smell? That came from decay. This wasn't some bad dream or ghost story. What he saw was part of a sacred ceremony, a full-blown religious festival. The scariest part was that nobody had a choice about showing up. What I'm about to walk you through is so brutal that historians once believed it had to be exaggerated propaganda, until archaeologists started digging and confirmed it was real. The place where all this happened was called Uppsala. For about 500 years straight, Uppsala stood as the strongest and most feared pagan center in all of Europe. And here's what we're about to uncover together. First, how they used fear itself as a weapon with a temple that was wrapped in a golden chain you could spot from miles away, and why one of the 3 statues inside had an enormous stone phallus. Second, we're diving into the 9-day blood-soaked festival where they sacrificed 9 of everything that breathed, and why even Christians who had already converted were still forced to take part or cough up payment. Third, there's the twisted story of a king who was so terrified of dying that he ended up killing his own sons one by one, and the horrifying fate he earned for himself because of it. And finally, we'll get to the sudden nighttime raid that burned everything down in a single wave of fire, murder, and betrayal. Now, I'll be honest, some of this sounds made up, like something out of a dark fantasy novel. That's why, at the end, I'm going to break down exactly what archaeology has proven actually happened. And what's going to shock you the most is realizing which parts of this story were toned down. So let's rewind and start with what travelers saw the very first time they arrived. Picture me as a merchant back in the year 1050, riding through the endless forests of Svealand after weeks on the road. Along the way, I've been hearing uneasy rumors about a place called Uppsala. Dark stories whispered by nervous people who won't quite meet my eyes. Then the trees suddenly thin out, and what I see when the forest opens up stops me dead in my tracks. Huge burial mounds rise up in every direction, shaped like mountains but built by human hands, each one hundreds of feet wide. Together, they form what looks like a massive natural stadium, an amphitheater carved into the earth itself. The locals say these mounds hold the bodies of the gods, Thor, Odin, and Freyr. But strangely enough, that's not what hits me hardest. Right in the middle of it all, shining under the northern sunlight, stands a structure wrapped completely in a golden chain. And that chain is doing exactly what it was meant to do. It's broadcasting a warning you can see from miles away. It tells you one simple thing. You are stepping into the home of the gods, and they see everything. Now sure, people still argue about whether the building itself was solid gold. We'll get to that later. But the chain? That part was absolutely real, and it was genius-level psychological warfare. Because before I even walk through the door, I already believe these people hold real power. And when I finally step inside, past that glowing chain, I'm met with a sight that sends chills straight up my spine. 3 massive statues, all seated on towering thrones. In the center sits Thor, the strongest of them all. He controls thunder, lightning, rain, and whether my family eats this year or starves. When sickness spreads or crops fail, Thor is the one you beg for mercy. He's your last line of defense against being wiped off the face of the earth. To one side is Odin, the wild and furious one. He's carved in full battle armor, shaped like a Roman war god, and he's the one who gives fighters their strength. If you're about to die with a blade in your hand, you pray Odin notices you because only he decides who makes it into Valhalla. And on the other side sits Freyr, the god tied to fertility and pleasure. This is where things take a strange turn. The man who recorded all this was a German Christian monk, and the way he describes Freyr sounds like he's barely keeping his composure. He writes that the statue was made with an immense phallus. And yeah, that means they placed a massive stone penis right inside their most sacred temple. But before anyone starts laughing, it's important to understand the world they lived in. This wasn't about vulgar jokes. Most kids didn't make it past 5 years old. Women routinely died giving birth. Entire family bloodlines could be erased by one brutal winter. For them, reproduction wasn't romance, it was survival. These three gods covered the three main ways your world could end: starvation, violence, or your family dying out completely. All of that fear was packed into one building. Three gods. Three emergency panic buttons for the end of everything. And every 9 years, they threw a massive festival to keep those gods satisfied. That festival is where this whole story stops being interesting and starts becoming nightmare fuel. They called it the Great Blot, and it happened once every 9 years, timed with the spring equinox. And here's the part that really messes with your head. Everyone had to be there. If you lived in Sweden, you either showed up or you paid a price. The records don't mince words about this. They clearly state that nobody was exempt from attending this festival. Even Christians, people who had already turned their backs on these gods, were still forced to participate in the rituals or, as the sources say, by their immunity. The pagan priests held so much authority that they were able to shake down Christians for money. It was basically medieval religious protection rackets. The festival itself stretched on for 9 straight days. And that number 9 meant everything to the Norse world. There were 9 realms on the world tree Yggdrasil. Odin himself hung from that tree for 9 nights. 9, 9, 9. That number was everything to them. And when it came time for sacrifice, they didn't pick at random. For every living thing that was male, they took 9 heads. Now, you might be thinking, alright, 9 cows, 9 horses, 9 goats. Still brutal, but at least it's something the mind can grasp. The truth was far worse than that. A 72-year-old Christian man who witnessed one of these festivals later gave his account to a German chronicler. What he saw stayed with him for the rest of his life. He said it wasn't just people being killed. Men were hung right alongside dogs and horses. 72 bodies in total, all dangling together from the branches of one enormous tree. A tree that, according to him, stayed green through both winter and summer. Clearly meant to mirror Yggdrasil, the great world tree from Norse legend. And here's the part that makes it even darker. That number wasn't accidental. 9 days multiplied by 8 different species equals 72. This wasn't wild, mindless brutality. This was calculated, structured. This was violence built on numbers, like cold-blooded math written in rope and blood. But the part that truly shows how alien their thinking was comes from how they viewed that grove. We'd walk into a place like that and see decay, contamination, unspeakable horror. They walked in and saw something sacred. Listen to how it was described. The grove was considered so holy that every single tree in it was believed to be divine because of the death and rot of the victims. The trees weren't holy in spite of the decay. They were holy because of it. Their idea of the divine didn't live in some clean, shining heaven. It lived underground, in roots soaking up rot, growing strong on death. To them, holiness wasn't purity. It was decomposition. And the grove wasn't even the worst of it. They also had a well. They would take a living man and plunge him straight into the black water. And here was the test. If he vanished completely, if he sank and never came back up, then the gods had accepted the offering and the people's wish would be granted. Just imagine that crowd standing there, holding their breath, staring into the water, silently praying for a man to disappear forever. Now I know exactly what you're thinking. This can't possibly be true. This sounds like something ripped straight out of a medieval horror story. And honestly, that kind of doubt makes sense. In a little while, I'll break down what history confirms and what might be exaggeration. But before that, you need to hear about a king who pushed this entire system of sacrifice beyond anything else. And what it cost him was so disturbing that people have been telling the story as a warning for nearly 900 years. His name was Arn. And the old Viking sagas all agree on one thing about him. He was everything a Viking king was not supposed to be. The text straight up says he wasn't a warrior and preferred to stay at home. He'd already been chased out of his own kingdom twice. He was seen as a coward, a weak man, someone unworthy of the throne he happened to inherit. But Arn had one driving obsession that ruled every decision he made. He didn't want to die. Not for honor, not for glory. He just wanted more time. So he brought offerings to Odin, the All-Father, the god who once hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, the Lord of the Gallows. And Odin answered him. At first, the promise sounded like a gift. You will live. But then came the cost. One of your sons. Every 10th year. Until there are none left. And Arn agreed. He looked at his 9 boys, his blood, his future, his legacy. And he chose himself. Again. And again. And again. And this is where Odin shows just how cruel the bargain really was. Because Arn got his life. But he lost everything else. After sacrificing 7 sons, Arn lived 10 more years. But by then, he was so weak he couldn't even walk. They had to carry him around in a chair. After the 8th son was killed, he survived another decade. But now he was completely bedridden. Couldn't stand. Couldn't move. Just lying there, breathing. After the 9th son, after murdering 9 of his own children, he was granted yet another 10 years. But by this point, he barely counted as human. He was ancient, ruined. His teeth had all fallen out. He couldn't chew. He couldn't even drink the normal way anymore. He had to suck milk through the horn of an ox, like a helpless infant. There's an old poem from that time that captures it perfectly. It says he lived until he had to press his toothless mouth to a deer's horn. And the man who spilled his children's blood had to suck his food through an ox's horn. A king who slaughtered his own sons, now reduced to a fragile, toothless wreck, unable to feed himself, drinking from a horn because he can't even swallow right anymore. That was Odin's gift, a life stripped of dignity, strength, and meaning. After 9 sacrifices, after decades of horror, and somehow he still had 1 son left. And unbelievably, he wanted to sacrifice that one too. But at long last, the Swedish people stepped in and said no more. They stopped him. After watching him butcher 9 of his own sons, the people finally draw the line. They refused to allow the 10th sacrifice. And without that final offering, the strange spell holding King Arn together breaks. Not long after, he dies. But Odin isn't finished humiliating him yet. The sagas say his death becomes known forever as Arn illness. That's the name they give to dying peacefully of old age, without sickness or battle. Now think about how brutal that is in Viking culture. This was a world where the greatest honor was dying in combat, where Valhalla only welcomed you if you fell with a weapon in your hand, fighting to the last breath. So what does Arn get for slaughtering his children and clinging to life for decades? The deepest shame imaginable. He dies quietly in a bed, a toothless shell of a man who destroyed everything that once made him human. Odin gave him exactly what he begged for, and it ruined him. Arn's story lives on as a legend, a warning. But what came next at Uppsala wasn't legend at all. That part was recorded as real history, and somehow it's even more intense. The year was 1087. The place was Uppsala, and the prize at stake was nothing less than the soul of Sweden. On one side stood King Inga the Elder, a devoted Christian who flat out refused to perform pagan sacrifices. On the other side was his brother-in-law, a man known as Blot Swain, literally Swain the Sacrificer. Everything comes to a head at the Thing, the great public assembly where the nation's biggest decisions were settled. There, the pagan leaders issue their ultimatum to the Christian king. Either follow the old gods and perform the sacrifices or leave. King Inga rises to speak and tells them plainly, "I will not abandon the true faith." The crowd explodes. They shout him down. They start throwing stones. And they literally chase him out of his own kingdom. Inga is forced to flee to Västergötland, now an exiled king. And that's when Blot Swain makes his move. He steps before the people and makes them a deal. "Crown me king, and I'll carry out the sacrifices for you." They accept on the spot. And to seal their return to the old gods, they bring a horse into the assembly. They slaughter it, chop it apart for food, and smear the sacred tree with its blood. Just like that, the old gods are back in charge. But King Inga isn't finished yet. And what he does next sounds like something straight out of a movie. Except it really happened. 3 years pass. Blot Swain rules as king. The pagans celebrate. Christianity starts losing ground. And then, one early morning, King Inga comes back. The sagas say he rode day and night with a small group of men, moving fast and staying silent. Before anyone knows what's happening, He catches Blotswain by surprise at dawn. The sources give us two slightly different versions of what happens next. But both versions are savage. In the first, Inga's men surround Sweyn's house and barricade the doors. Then they light it up with everyone still trapped inside. The saga says they took the house right over Sweyn's head and burned him in it. In the second version, they also set the house on fire, but when Sweyn tries to break through the flames to escape, they cut him down on the spot. Either way, Blotswain dies in fire and blood. History often calls this moment the burning of the temple at Uppsala. But here's the twist most people don't realize. The sagas never actually say that Inga burned a temple. They say he burned Sweyn's hole, his house. So what was that hole they burned down? It wasn't some random shack. It was his royal residence. And here's the truth most people miss: they were the same thing. Modern archaeology finally confirmed what historians long suspected. The Vikings didn't separate temples and palaces the way we do. At Uppsala, the king's great banquet hall and the house of the gods were one and the same building. So when King Inga torched that hall, he didn't just assassinate his rival. He wiped out the spiritual center of Swedish paganism in one brutal move. Political power and religious authority both went up in flames at the same time. It was the pagan version of a national catastrophe, one strike that changed everything. Now let's get honest about what was real and what was propaganda, because I promised you the truth, and some of this might surprise you. Was there really a golden temple like the stories say? Almost certainly not in the way it was described. The man who gave us the golden chain, the 3 statues, all of it, Adam of Bremen, never actually went to Uppsala himself. His account was secondhand, and scholars now believe he may have modeled parts of it after the biblical Temple of Solomon to give his Christian audience a familiar kind of enemy. When archaeologists dug beneath the modern church at Uppsala, they didn't find gold. What they found were post holes, the massive outlines of Iron Age royal halls. But here's the funny part. The real version is actually more Viking than the myth. That temple wasn't just a religious space. It was the Viking White House. Political deals, royal feasts, war planning, and sacrifices to the gods all happened under the same roof. So yeah, the golden building was exaggerated, but the power behind it was very real. Now what about the worst parts? The 72 bodies, the ritual hangings, the wells filled with sacrifices? There's no direct archaeological proof that 72 bodies were ever hung at Uppsala specifically. But archaeology has confirmed those exact practices at other Viking sites. At the Trelleborg fortress in Denmark, they found the skeletons of 4 young children, ages 4 to 7, ritually placed in wells. So Adam's story about plunging live people into water to test the gods? That part checks out. Then there's the Oseberg ship burial tapestry from the year 834. It shows 9 men hanging from a large tree. The Grove of the Hanged existed too, just not necessarily at Uppsala. So Adam didn't invent these horrors out of thin air. He took real, documented Viking rituals, ritual hanging, drownings in wells, mass sacrifice, and concentrated all of them into one terrifying super site. He turned Uppsala into the final boss of pagan evil. So was it all lies? No. Was it all perfectly accurate? Also no. The horror was real. It just wasn't all in one neat package at one single location. And you know what is 100% real and still standing today? Those massive burial mounds that formed the natural amphitheater around Uppsala. They're genuine 6th century royal graves. Archaeologists uncovered warriors buried with luxury weapons and clothing woven with golden thread. The setting was real. The stage was real. The power was real. The only real question is how much of the performance was cranked up for the audience back home. What gets me about this whole story is that for 500 years, Uppsala was the beating heart of Viking paganism. Kings went there to legitimize their rule. Ordinary people went there when they were desperate, when crops failed, when enemies closed in, when they felt the gods were the only hope left. And then, in a single night, with one fire and one sudden raid, it all ended. King Inga's dawn attack shattered the illusion that the old gods were untouchable. Within a generation, pagan worship was fading into legend. The temple was gone. The priesthood was gone. The rituals were over. But the stories didn't die. The golden chain, the The 72 bodies. The Mad King sucking milk through a horn. Those images were too powerful, too disturbing, too unforgettable. They survived. Anytime you read about dark rituals in fantasy books, when you see human sacrifice in movies, when gods demand blood on the screen, you're seeing the shadow of Uppsala. The temple turned to ash. But the mythology, that part never burned. And if you made it this far, I know you're the kind of person who likes the dark, strange corners of history they don't teach in school. So now I've got to ask you, do you think Adam of Bremen was telling the truth? Or was this all medieval propaganda? Were the Vikings really that extreme, or has history been exaggerating it for 1,000 years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And yeah, if you got something out of this, hit that like button. Special thanks to the channel members Josh, Heath, and Momo. This channel's just getting started. Grab your wolf badge and let the gods know you were here before the crowd showed up.